Hey y'all, and good now, whenever and wherever this finds you. Will the hits keep rolling in? Today we're talking about more about how we'll get to energy independence by 2030. The Congress actually did something, and they passed this thing called the IRA, the in- inflammation, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so there's like billions of dollars in there, and it's for uh, t- climate change projects. So I've got their video about this is the CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and they had a lot to do with getting this done. So I'm here to share their video.
So let's jump into it. The Inflation Reduction Act, we love it. It is a great bill. It is our first really major federal climate legislation with big climate solutions in it. And according to various energy modeling groups, it will help us get to 40% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States below 2005 levels by 2030. If we can also get some permitting reform done, which I'll also be talking about today, about the importance of combining permitting reform to make sure that we are able to achieve those emissions cuts. So to put this into some graphical context, this is US greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 through 2021 last year. You can see where our emissions were going down a little bit slowly, but they were going down thanks to coal being phased out and replaced by cleaner electricity sources. You can see in the bottom right here, this red triangle is our Paris targets, trying to get to that 50% cuts by 2030. And so prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, this is the track that we were on in our business as usual, headed for something like a 27% cut in emissions by 2030 with some uncertainty there. So you can see roughly halfway short of our Paris target. And so this is why the Inflation Reduction Act was so important to get us accelerating this transition towards clean energy sources. And so the modeling groups looked at what the Inflation Reduction Act would achieve. And that's this green envelope here. You can see there's a lot of uncertainty, a very big envelope there of possible net greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030, because there's a lot of stuff that could happen over the next 7 years. We don't know what fossil fuel prices, oil prices will look like. We don't know how many people will take advantage of the tax incentives and rebates in the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a variety of different factors that create this big uncertainty window of possible emissions cuts going into the future. And one of those big uncertainty factors is permitting, because as I'll talk about, permitting right now is going quite slowly, which probably right now puts us on the higher end of this envelope. But on average, the middle of this window is a 40% cut below 2005 levels by 2030, which would be a really big boost from our previous business as usual of 27% cuts, getting us much closer, not all the way to our Paris target, but much closer to it. So that's why we were super excited and happy about the Inflation Reduction Act getting passed. So what exactly is in the bill and how does it achieve those cuts? The biggest single factor is the tax credits for clean energy sources like wind and solar, but there's also some for geothermal, for nuclear, basically anything that's a low carbon or zero carbon electricity source gets a tax credit extending over the next decade. So there's a lot of certainty for individuals and businesses and private equity trying to invest in these clean energy projects. Now they know that tax credits will be there in the long term. And so now there's going to be this really big boost in investments in these clean energy sources. And that's going to hopefully decarbonize our electricity sector and make a big difference in our emissions reductions. We, of course, are also very excited about the methane fee in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's going to be combined with some updated EPA methane regulations on the oil and gas sector, which the EPA is in the process of working on. The EPA says that once those are finalized, they will reduce oil and gas sector methane pollution by about 87%. So really tackling those, the leakage and other methane releases from the oil and gas sector. And then the methane fee is basically like the teeth to those regulations. So if a company or a facility is not in compliance with those new, more stringent EPA methane regulations, then they will have to pay the methane fee in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's really important to give that kind of enforcement mechanism and that financial incentive for oil and gas companies and facilities to actually be in compliance with those methane regulations. So it's our first federal climate pollution fee. It's not a carbon price, but it's a methane price. It's a good start, and it kind of sets the table for future carbon pollution and other greenhouse gas pollution fees, we hope. Then there are the incentives, tax credits for electric vehicles, which are a little bit complicated because it depends on kind of the source of the minerals and where the batteries are manufactured. But generally speaking, there's going to be some nice tax credits for electric cars, both used and new ones. So that'll be really nice to get some tax credits for used cars and get people buying some used EVs so that not everybody has to buy new ones. There's also some great incentives for and rebates for building electrification and efficiency that I'll talk about. There's some funding for natural climate solutions like healthy forests, of course, that we are beginning to work on in CCL. And there's some incentives for clean technology innovation and domestic green manufacturing to get more of these clean technologies built and manufactured in the United States, which is great. So we're not relying on other countries like China so much to build and manufacture these green technologies. And so let's talk about those potential benefits for homeowners. I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but we have this great tool from Rewiring America called the IRA Savings Calculator. We got the short URL at the top of the screen here, cclusa.org/IRA-calc. Will take you to this Rewiring America Savings Calculator. And so this tells people basically what tax incentives and rebates they qualify for in home upgrades through the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's especially good for low and middle income households. Low income households have 100% of their costs up to $14,000 per household, plus tax credits covered by the benefits in the Inflation Reduction Act. Middle income households get 50% coverage. And these are defined as a low-income household is 80% or less of the local median income, and a middle-income household is 80% to 150% of the local median income. And so you don't have to look up the local median income and figure out where you fall. This is all incorporated into the Rewiring America Savings Calculator. And so you just put in your zip code, homeowner status, household income, tax filing status, and household size. And it will plug that all in and calculate it for you and tell you which of these incentives you qualify for, whether they are tax credits or upfront rebates, how large they are, and when they come into effect, whether they're already into effect or 2023 or 2024. So this is a really great tool for educating yourself and your friends and family and anybody you know about which of these incentives you can qualify for to electrify and make your home more efficient. For example, there's rooftop solar, there's water pump or water heater heat pumps, there is household HVAC system heat pumps, there is electric stoves, there is building insulation and windows to weatherize your homes. So there's a lot of different and then there's a lot more than that. So there's a lot of different incentives that you could potentially qualify for. So we encourage everybody to check this out and to tell everybody you know about this calculator so that we can get people taking advantage of these incentives, because it's great that the incentives are there, but if people aren't taking advantage of them, then they're not doing anybody any good. And so education on this topic is really important, and it's a big component of our building electrification and efficiency policy agenda, as I talked about yesterday. So in general, the IRA is going to make a big change in the US economy as a whole. So in 2030, we're expecting up to 85% of our electricity to come from clean sources, predominantly from solar and wind. I talked about yesterday, right now we have something like, I think it was 260 gigawatts of solar and wind electricity installed in the United States, which we've installed over the past 20 years. And we're going to do something like, I think, 760 gigawatts projected over the next 7 years. And so, like, if you imagine all these solar panels and wind turbines in the United States right now, if you triple that, that is what we are projecting will be built and installed over the next 7 years, again, with the permitting reform caveat that we'll talk about. So lots and lots of wind turbines and solar panels, hopefully getting deployed in the United States. Kind of a mind-blowing amount. Another big change is in vehicle sales. It's hard to predict exactly the number of new car sales in 2030 that will be electric. The challenge is that, like, electric cars will be probably the cheapest cars to buy in 2030 because, for one thing, battery costs are going to keep going down, and then we will have all the car companies will probably at that point have made the changes in their production necessary to qualify for the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. They'll all be domestic or made or mined in free trade allies. And so at that point, electric cars will be cheaper to buy up front than gasoline cars. They're already cheaper to fuel than gasoline cars, and they are cheaper to maintain already than gasoline cars because they have fewer moving parts. You don't have to do oil changes and things like that. And so electric cars is going to be the cheapest option straight up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to buy an electric car. And then thanks to the incentives for companies to do this domestic clean energy manufacturing, there's going to be a whole bunch of new jobs in clean energy to deploy all these wind turbines and solar panels in clean manufacturing. Also building retrofits, because everybody's going to be, well, a lot of people are going to be, taking advantage of these incentives to get the new, heat pumps and induction stoves and insulation and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of jobs in making that happen. We're going to need actually a lot new electricians because we're also going to have to do home wiring upgrades to make sure that the home wiring systems can take care of all that increased demand for electricity. And so there's actually a little bit of a concern, maybe we won't have enough electricians trained by 2030 to make this all happen. And so, like, if you know anybody who's trying to figure out what career to go into, like, electrician is going to be a really good career it's going to pay well, and it's going to have a lot of job security because we're going to need a lot of these electric upgrades. So the IRA also invests in cities. It has investments for EVs and public transit charging, which is really important because if you don't have EV charging stations, then you can't make these upgrades. People won't buy EVs, and we can't do like electric buses and things like that if we don't have the charging systems to charge them. So that's really important infrastructure investments. There's also energy efficiency credits and rebates for businesses, schools, churches, and government buildings. That was always a challenge because, like, businesses and schools and churches, they don't have tax liability, and so they can't take advantage of tax credits since they don't have any tax liability to offset. And so there was a change in the Inflation Reduction Act that they can take the tax credit and transfer it to, like, an architect or a construction work group or something like that, who can then give them a rebate or basically give them a discount. And so there basically allows them to take advantage of these tax credits. There are also rebates for zero emissions garbage trucks and buses, which is great, especially buses. Like, they're always going around the city, and like if they're using diesel or gasoline, they're creating a lot of pollution as they drive by. And so, like, that's a really good use for electric vehicles because then they're not creating that local air pollution, and they're always going the same route and then stopping overnight. And so that's a great opportunity for them to charge up. So that's a great application. There are also grants for cities to grow urban forests, which I talked about yesterday, is really important, especially as we're seeing more extreme heat waves in cities. You got all this concrete and asphalt that kind of absorbs and radiates the heat. And so cities are particularly hot and particularly impacted by these worsening heat waves. And so the more green spaces and urban trees you can plant, the more relief it gives from those heat waves. And that's a really important kind of adaptation solution in addition to pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere. There's also specific investments for disadvantaged communities. There's funding for community-led projects for equitable transportation access, to reduce pollution at key pollution hubs like ports and railways and airports and near schools, so that people in those communities aren't breathing all of that air pollution. And there are also grants for energy efficient, affordable housing, which is great. Anything we can do to improve energy efficiency in housing, especially in communities that it's difficult for them to afford, is excellent. And specifically, there's this thing called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is also known as the National Green Bank. So there's $27 billion of funding for that Green Bank that will go for direct and indirect investments in projects to reduce greenhouse gases at the local level. A whole bunch of that for disadvantaged communities. There's specifically $7 billion available for low-income and disadvantaged communities to deploy or benefit from rooftop solar, which we all, of course, love rooftop solar, and other greenhouse gas reduction activities. There is $12 billion available to reduce or avoid greenhouse gas and other air pollution by leveraging investments from the private sector or by assisting communities in efforts to reduce or avoid pollution in other ways. And that's a project that's, or a funding stream that is administered by the EPA. And that's something that we're hoping a lot of cities and disadvantaged communities can take advantage of. On top of that, there are these climate pollution reduction grants. These are for municipalities that want to take climate action and planning to reduce their greenhouse gas pollution. So those have to include information about how they're going to reduce their greenhouse gas air pollution in low income and disadvantaged communities. So again, it's specifically targeting disadvantaged communities to help them reduce their air pollution or carbon pollution. Again, that's administered by the EPA, and there's this requirement that there has to be at least one grant in each state. So we're trying to kind of spread it out so that everybody is able to take advantage of these funds and these grants. And then there's some provisions to help cities reduce their emissions. There is funding available for cities to do zero building energy code adoptions. So this is basically to encourage cities to improve their building codes to basically require new buildings to be more energy efficient through the building code process, which is a really good way because, you know, any new building you're constructing has to follow the local building codes. And so the more stringent they are, those building codes, in requiring that buildings be energy efficient and low carbon, that will do a lot to reduce emissions from the building sector in cities where there's a lot of buildings. There is also a clean heavy duty vehicles program where municipalities and nonprofit school transportation associations will be eligible for funding to replace fossil fuel vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, with zero emissions vehicles. So that again is things like garbage trucks, heavy duty trucks, buses. I believe this applies to school buses, which again, like I'm a big fan of getting electric school buses because you get the school bus driving up when there's a bunch of kids waiting in line and they're breathing all the diesel pollution from the exhaust of the bus. And so, you know, that's creates all kinds of adverse health effects for the kids. And so if you can electrify that, that eliminates that pollution source and makes kids healthier. And again, the buses are going the same route every day, and then they park overnight where they could be charging up if there is a charging station. And so electrification of school buses is like a really big win-win-win. Like it's something we should be doing as much and as quickly as possible. So that's another EPA program. There is also a low emissions electricity program that allocates funding via the EPA for outreach and technical assistance to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from domestic electricity and generation and use. There's also some programs for resilience and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So for example, there's environmental and climate justice block grants for community-led efforts to monitor, prevent, and remedy pollution, plus investments in low and zero emissions resilient technologies. And there's forestry conservation programs, which is again kind of relevant to our healthy forest policy agenda area. So these are through the Department of Agriculture to support tree planting activities through urban community forestry assistance program. And then it's not just cities, of course, there are also investments in rural communities. So, for example, there is money for wildfire resilience and to help firefighters who are always fighting worse and worse wildfires. That's really important. Like for me, I'm in California, and these wildfires are a super big concern here as they keep getting worse. And so, the more funding we can send programs to make us more resilient to wildfires and to lessen wildfire threats, the better. So I think there was $7 billion in funding for wildfire resilience between the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure package. There's also $4 billion, I believe, for drought mitigation and resilience, doing things like helping farmers to be more water efficient, because agriculture is a big use of water. And again, in the West, we're really concerned about these worsening droughts and lack of water availability. And so there's funding to help farmers in particular use less water, also to protect existing bodies of water so that we're drawing less from those bodies of water and preserving them as best as possible. So yeah, great funding for addressing drought threats. There are clean energy grants to electric co-ops, and there's also clean energy investments and jobs that will particularly benefit rural communities because as I talked about yesterday, we're going to be building all these big wind and solar farms. And because land in rural areas is much more available and affordable than land in urban areas, that's where most of these big solar and wind farms get built. And that creates a lot of jobs in rural areas and also creates revenue streams from leasing of land, from taxes and things like that. And so this is why clean energy tends to be very popular in even red states with a lot of rural areas because they get a lot of economic benefits from it. You know, the biggest wind states are like Texas and Iowa and Kansas and Oklahoma, you know, down the middle of the country where there's a lot of wind. And these are pretty red states and they love their wind energy because it brings in a lot of jobs and revenue. And then there's also assistance for farmers, ranchers, and foresters. So there is a bunch of money for conservation programs to store carbon in soil and trees. This is a really interesting one. So it was kind of labeled as $20+ billion for like climate smart agriculture and forestry programs. So these go to existing programs, and the challenge is that these programs don't currently include carbon and climate as criterion for the programs that they provide grants for. So they're kind of more general conservation programs that aren't particularly climate programs. And so one thing we're hoping to possibly work on in the coming year is to use the Farm Bill to tweak these programs to make climate and or carbon a top criterion so that those $20 billion in funds can actually be spent on things that are good for the climate and not just on general conservation programs, but on things like silvopasture that I talked about yesterday, or cover cropping on farms, things that actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm hoping we can work on that in the coming year. We're going to have to see if that's a good option for us. There's also funding for forest health, for forest preservation, for things that protect existing forests in the United States, money for climate smart forest management and conservation, including particularly on privately owned forests, giving private forest owners some incentives to do practices that will conserve the forest and conserve the carbon that is being sequestered by the trees. And then there's also kind of indirect benefits that when, again, we are phasing out fossil fuel pollution by transition to clean energy, and fossil fuel ozone pollution turns out to suppress crop yields. And so as we phase out these fossil fuels and transition to clean energy and reduce our ozone air pollution, that will increase crop yields. And that's estimated to benefit American farmers to the tune of something like $400 million per year, just from the larger crop yields they're going to get from the cleaner air resulting from the clean energy deployed by the IRA. So that's the good news. The challenging news I talked a bit about yesterday in the permitting reform parts of our new policy agenda. So the good news again is that solar and wind are going to explode thanks to those tax credits, hopefully a tripling of the solar and wind energy in the United States over the next 7 years. But those big wind and solar farms are going to get built out in the rural areas, also out in the middle of the country. Again, that's where we have most of the wind blowing that's available. And so you need to be able to transmit that electricity from those wind turbines and solar panels out kind of where there's fewer people to the population centers, mostly along the coasts and in cities that have the demand for the clean electricity. And so to do that, you need to build some long distance transmission lines to connect the clean electricity to get it to the population centers that need it. But that is right now a very slow process. Right now, we're only expanding our electric transmission infrastructure at 1% per year, and we need to speed that up. We need to get it to at least 2% per year, ideally. The good news is we were expanding it at 2% per year a couple of decades ago. That used to be the norm, and it's slowed down over the past decade or so as stuff has been kind of clogged up in the permitting process and other factors slowing down our infrastructure build out. The challenge is, as I talked about yesterday, we need to triple our transmission of clean electricity by 2050 if we're going to hit our net zero pledge under the Paris agreements. And it takes agencies an average of 4.5 years to complete an environmental impact statement for really big energy projects that could potentially have some significant environmental impacts. And that is a very long time. And just in general, transmission lines right now take on average a little over a decade to build in the United States. And 2030 is now about 7 years away. And so we're just not building this infrastructure fast enough, and especially transmission lines, not building them fast enough to get this deployment of clean energy accomplished and meet our Paris targets and take advantage of these IRA emissions reductions. So this is why permitting reform is critical if we're going to make this clean energy transition happen fast enough to meet our Paris commitments. And the estimate, according to modeling by the Princeton Energy Modeling Group, is that if we don't start building clean energy infrastructure faster, we're only going to achieve about 20% of the potential carbon pollution reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act. So we need to speed things up to unlock those benefits. So I showed this chart yesterday, but we're looking at the difference between making these transmission build-outs and achieving permitting reform and not doing so. So this, again, similar chart is our emissions to date between 2005 and 2022. The black dotted line across the middle is our Paris target, trying to get to that 50% cuts by 2030. Right now, we're on track for something like 28%. Again, there's lots of uncertainty, as we saw in that previous chart. A lot of uncertainty in exactly what this number is going to be in 2030 because of fossil fuel prices and federal efforts to do permitting reform and things like that. But we're somewhere in this ballpark on this track right now. But if we can get the permitting reform unlocked and make our infrastructure build out happen faster through things like federal efforts and congressional permitting reform, then we can get to those 40% emissions reductions that we talked about earlier from the Inflation Reduction Act and get much closer to our Paris targets. And then we talked about yesterday, there's also more stuff we can do. We can get a carbon price in place along with permitting reform that would get us to achieving our Paris target of over 50% cuts by 2030. And we can also do some carbon removal through healthy forests to pull some more carbon out of the atmosphere and deploy these IRA benefits and incentives for building efficiency and electrification, get lots of heat pumps out there and building insulation and things like that, solar panels on people's roofs, and then we can get to potentially a 60% reduction in emissions by 2030 if we can get all that stuff done in the coming few years. So again, very ambitious, but we like being ambitious, and that's what we're going to try to do. How do we do that? The good news is that the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed a year ago and the Inflation Reduction Act already had some measures to help speed up the process, especially the Inflation Reduction Act had funding for federal agencies that do these environmental impact assessments and other environmental reviews during the permitting process. So if they have more funding, they can hire more staff and devote more resources to getting these reviews done in a more expedited manner. And so that by itself should somewhat speed up the process to get these projects permitted and going. There is also the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, that has proposed a number of different new rules to do things like, for one example, they're trying to do cost allocation, which is an issue where when you have a pretty long transmission line, then everybody starts to fight over who's going to pay for how much of it, and that fight can really slow down the process. So FERC's got a proposed rule that, at least for some types of transmission lines, they can allocate the costs to basically the proportion of the benefits that different utilities and individuals get. And so if they can just do that kind of automatically and get everybody to agree, which is a challenge that FERC kind of has to get everybody to agree to make this happen, then that can really speed up the process by avoiding these fights. That's also something that was included in the permitting reform proposal from Senator Manchin, to kind of just make that a general rule, so that that's kind of automatically happens to avoid these fights. So things like that from FERC, they're trying to accelerate the process by loosening up these bottlenecks, also doing like multiple reviews at once instead of doing one review of one project at a time, reviewing multiple projects that are similar all at the same time. So FERC is doing what they can do. And then there's also federal law changes by Congress, trying to expedite the process by, again, giving FERC more authority for these interstate lines, the cost allocations that I talked about, things like that. Members of Congress are working hard to figure out what they can accomplish through federal congressional permitting reform package agreement.
Well, I have to admit that I joined this group last summer, and I kind of thought that they were a little bit too tight-ass for me. But anyway, look what they got done. And so I feel like, when the story about the chicken went around and said, who wants to bake bread? And nobody wanted to bake bread, but once the bread was baked, everybody wanted to eat it. So it's like, they baked this bread, and I'm jumping all over it. And it's like, but, it's good to spread the word. And so I hope that you enjoyed this, and you'll spread this word and let everybody know that we have a real opportunity that rarely comes, but it's right at the right time. So energy independence is possible by 2030. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you down the road.